Eleanor Hastings did not cry the night her sister walked into that dining room and stole the air from every corner of it. She sat perfectly still, both hands folded in her lap, and watched Colonel Nathaniel Ashford turn slowly the way a man turns when something unexpected catches his eye, and look at Lillian, like she was the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. Eleanor did not flinch. She simply reached beneath the table and pressed her fingers against the ledger she'd been carrying for 11 years. Still there. Still hers. If you're watching this, subscribe, stay until the end, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Hastings estate sat on 412 acres of Virginia bottomland, and Eleanor knew every inch of it the way other women knew their own faces, by feel, by memory, by the slow accumulation of years spent paying attention when no one else thought it mattered. She had been managing the books since she was 15. Not because anyone asked her to, because her father's eyesight had begun to fail in the winter of 1799, and someone had to read the columns, and Eleanor was the one who didn't mind sitting still for hours with a candle and a quill and numbers that never lied to you, not once, not ever. She was 26 now. She had spent more of her life in that study than anywhere else on earth, and she had never, not in 11 years of ledger work and land surveys and correspondence with every mill operator and water rights attorney in the county, ever seen the numbers add up the way Silas Mercer said they did. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, Colonel Nathaniel Ashford was coming to dinner. Eleanor had known about the arrangement for 3 weeks. Her father had told her on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the breakfast table with his coffee going cold, in the flat, careful tone he used when he'd already made a decision and wasn't looking for a conversation about it. "Ashford's a reasonable man," Thomas Hastings had said. "Served with distinction. Good land holdings down in Albemarle County. He's looking for a settled situation. I think you two will suit each other well enough." Eleanor had looked at him over the rim of her own cup. "You think we'll suit?" "I do." "Have you asked him?" Her father had almost smiled. "I've written to him." "That's not the same thing." "Eleanor." He'd set down his cup. "I'm not asking you to fall in love with the man. I'm asking you to meet him at dinner and be civil." She had been civil her entire life. She was very good at it. She said, "All right, father," and went back to her coffee and spent the rest of that morning trying to decide how she felt about the whole business, and arriving, as she usually did, at the conclusion that feelings were less useful than preparation. So she prepared. She pulled every record she had on Ashford family land holdings. She read his military record, which her father's attorney had sent over without being asked, because the man had learned over the years that Eleanor Hastings would find a way to read whatever she needed to read one way or another. She mapped the topography of his Albemarle property in her head. She calculated water access, soil quality, seasonal yield estimates. By the morning of the dinner, she knew more about Nathaniel Ashford's land than he probably did. She did not know what he looked like. She hadn't thought to ask. He was taller than she expected. That was her first thought when Silas Mercer showed him into the front parlor. Not the warmth of his face, or the cut of his coat, or any of the things Lillian would have cataloged in the first 3 seconds, but simply that he was taller than she'd pictured, and that he carried himself the way men who'd spent years outdoors tended to carry themselves, like the ground beneath them was something they'd learned to trust. He looked at Eleanor first. She didn't know why. She was standing near the window, a little apart from her father and the 2 family friends who'd been invited to round out the table, and she supposed she was easy to look at, in the sense that she was the closest person to the door. But his eyes didn't move on quickly, the way eyes usually did when they landed on Eleanor Hastings. They stayed. "Miss Hastings," he said, and his voice was quieter than she expected too. Not soft exactly, but considered. Like a man who didn't speak unless he'd decided the words were worth the air. "Colonel Ashford," she said. "Welcome to Roseland." He glanced around the room, not the way a guest does admiring curtains and portraiture, but the way a man with a military background does taking inventory, marking exits and angles. Then he looked back at her. You have a lot of land. 412 acres. You say that like you've walked every one of them. I've surveyed every one of them, she said. Walking came first. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the beginning of one arrested, just before it arrived, as if he wasn't yet sure it was warranted. He opened his mouth to say something else. And then the door opened. Lillian Hastings was not supposed to be in Virginia. She was supposed to be in Charleston visiting their mother's cousin, a trip that had been planned for 6 weeks and was scheduled to last until the end of the month. Eleanor had organized the travel arrangements herself. She had written the letters, confirmed the dates, packed her sister's trunk, with the kind of quiet efficiency that Lillian accepted, the way she accepted most things Eleanor did for her without noticing it was being done. Lillian was not supposed to be here. She was here. She stood in the doorway in a traveling dress the color of summer sky. Her dark hair only slightly disordered from the road, and she looked around the room with the bright, sweeping assessment of a woman who had spent her entire 22 years understanding exactly what effect her entrance had on a room and using that understanding without apology or hesitation. Her eyes found Nathaniel Ashford in approximately 2 seconds. Eleanor watched it happen. She watched her sister's posture shift, the almost imperceptible straightening, the slight tilt of the chin, and she thought very clearly, "Ah, Papa." Lillian crossed the room and kissed their father's cheek. "I came home early. Mrs. Fairfax's house was stifling, and I missed Rosalind terribly." She pulled back and turned the full force of her attention on the room. "You must forgive me for interrupting. I didn't realize you had company." She had absolutely realized. Eleanor said nothing. She turned back to the window and looked out at the yard. Dinner was its own kind of theater. Lillian sat across from Nathaniel Ashford and talked to him about Charleston, about the social season, about the boat on the James River she'd traveled back on, and the interesting family she'd met in the process. She was charming. She was always charming. She had a gift for making conversation feel like something being offered specifically to you, like she had saved up these particular words and these particular observations for this particular person. And it was a genuine gift. Eleanor had never disputed that. She ate her soup and listened and said almost nothing. Once Nathaniel asked her a question. "Miss Hastings, your father mentioned you manage the estate accounts. Is that unusual for this county?" And she looked up from her bowl and said, "It depends on who you ask." And Lillian laughed and touched Nathaniel's arm and said, "Eleanor is being modest. She's practically run this entire property since she was a girl," in a tone that made it sound like a charming eccentricity rather than 11 years of uncompensated labor. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at her soup. After dinner, when the guests had moved to the parlor and her father was pouring brandy, Lillian appeared at Eleanor's side with the quiet precision of a woman who had learned to time her arrivals. "He's very handsome," Lillian murmured. "Is he?" "Don't do that. Don't go flat-voiced at me." Lillian picked up a glass from the sideboard and turned it in her fingers. "I'm only saying. Father does have good taste occasionally." "He's here to discuss an arrangement," Eleanor said. "It's not about handsome." "Everything is about handsome, darling, when you're 22 and have just come home from 6 weeks of absolutely nothing." Lillian glanced across the room at Nathaniel, who was talking with their father, and something in her expression went quieter, more deliberate in a way that Eleanor recognized. "He keeps looking at you, you know." "He's being polite." "He's being interested. There's a difference." Lillian set the glass down. "Don't waste it, Eleanor. You have a talent for wasting things." She drifted away before Eleanor could respond, which was almost certainly intentional, and Eleanor stood by the sideboard and looked at Nathaniel Ashford across the room, and thought, not for the first time in her life, that she was very tired of being the kind of person other people gave advice to. Nathaniel found her on the back porch just before 9 o'clock. She'd gone out to clear her head. The parlor had gotten warm, and she'd needed a moment without Lillian's perfume, and her father's careful watching, and the low conversational hum of people performing for each other. She was leaning against the railing with her arms folded, looking out at the dark stretch of the south field, when she heard the door behind her. She knew it was him before she turned around. She wasn't sure how. "Miss Hastings." He stopped a respectful distance away, hat in hand. "Forgive me, I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," she said. "It's my porch." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. He came to stand a few feet away from her, not beside her, and looked out at the field the same way she had been looking. "That's the south parcel?" She looked at him sideways. "You know the property layout." "I read the land survey your father's man sent over." "He sent you a land survey?" "He sent a letter of intent and the survey with it." He was quiet for a moment. "I read it carefully." "What did you make of it?" He turned his head and looked at her. Not the quick social assessment she was used to from men meeting her for the first time, but something slower and more deliberate, like he was deciding how honest to be. "I made of it that the acreage figures in your current assessment don't match the water boundary lines on the original 1798 deed." Eleanor went very still. She had noticed the same thing. She had noticed it in March and spent 3 months trying to determine whether it was a clerical error in the original surveying or something more intentional, and she had not mentioned it to anyone because she had no proof yet, and she had learned a long time ago that a woman with a suspicion and no documentation was just a woman making trouble. She looked at him for a long moment. "Colonel Ashford," she said carefully, "how carefully did you read that survey?" "Carefully enough to wonder," he said, "why 412 acres of bottomland with consistent water access is generating yield reports in line with high-ground dry acreage." He looked back out at the field. "That kind of discrepancy doesn't happen by accident." "No," Eleanor said. "It doesn't." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but weighted, like both of them were deciding how far to go. "I have 11 years of ledgers," she said finally. "I have my own surveys. I've been mapping the hydrological lines myself since 2010, since 1810, because the county records stopped being updated after 1809. He turned to look at her again. "I've been trying to figure out," she said, "who benefits from the discrepancy. And I have a strong suspicion," she said, "but I don't have proof yet." He was quiet for a long moment. The dark field stretched out in front of them, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called once and went silent, and Eleanor stood very straight and waited for him to say something dismissive. "That's a matter for your father. Or perhaps you've misread the figures, or any of the dozen things men said to Eleanor Hastings when she told them what she'd found in the numbers." "Would you show me?" he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. The ledgers, the surveys, your work." He was looking at her with that same steady, considered attention. "Would you show me what you found?" Eleanor Hastings had spent 11 years building a case that no one had ever asked to see. "Yes," she said, "I would." Silas Mercer had managed the Hastings land accounts for 17 years. He was 61 years old, with a broad red face, and the particular confident ease of a man who had never once been seriously questioned. He called Eleanor Miss Ellie, despite repeated corrections. He had a habit of summarizing her reports to her father in language that made them sound simpler and less alarming than they actually were. He had a network of county contacts going back 2 decades, including a cousin who sat on the Water Rights Commission, and a brother-in-law who handled deed recording at the county clerk's office. Eleanor had documented all of this. She had also documented over the past 8 months a pattern of entries in the quarterly accounts that didn't correspond to any physical change in the land, any weather event, any market fluctuation, or any legal modification to the estate holdings. Numbers that moved in ways that numbers shouldn't move. Adjustments recorded without explanation. Correspondence with land agents in 3 neighboring counties that her father had never been shown. She laid it all out on the study table the next morning. Every ledger, every hand-drawn map, every letter she'd copied out by hand because the originals were in Mercer's files, and she couldn't remove them without alerting him. Nathaniel Ashford pulled up a chair and sat down and did not say a word for 40 minutes. Eleanor sat across from him and watched him read. She had never had anyone read her work before. Not really. Her father looked at the summaries. The county attorney occasionally reviewed the filing documents. But no one had ever sat down with the raw materials, the 11 years of careful, obsessive, unglamorous record-keeping, and read it the way Nathaniel was reading it now, with his forearms on the table, and his eyes moving slowly, and his expression doing the thing it did when he was thinking, this quality of focused stillness that Eleanor was beginning to recognize, and find, she would not say, reassuring, that was too soft a word, clarifying. After 40 minutes he sat back. "This isn't an error," he said. "No," Eleanor said. "It's not. This is a pattern. 11 years. Consistent directional bias." He tapped one of the ledger pages. "Every adjustment reduces the assessed productivity of the bottom land. Every reduction lowers the tax and title valuation. Every lower valuation reduces the estate's legal standing in any boundary dispute," Eleanor said, "and artificially lowers the negotiated price in any transaction where acreage productivity is a factor." He looked up at her. "Who's been buying?" "3 parcels," Eleanor said. "Sold in 1805, 1809, and 1812, all to buyers with connections to the same land agent network." She slid a sheet across the table. "That network has Silas Mercer at the center." Nathaniel looked at the sheet for a long time. "Miss Hastings," he said, "do you understand what you've built here? I understand what I've found. You've found evidence of systematic fraud, not against one estate." He looked up again. "You said the agent network spans 3 counties. How many properties?" "I can document 6 with certainty," Eleanor said. "I believe there are more." He set the paper down very carefully. "You've been sitting on this for 8 months," he said. "I've been building a case," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled, that arrested almost smile she was beginning to recognize. "Who else knows about this?" "No one." "Not your father?" "My father trusts Silas Mercer. He has for 17 years. She met his eyes. "If I go to my father with a suspicion and no documentation complete enough to be irrefutable, Mercer will know within a week, and the documentation will disappear." "So you waited." "I've been careful," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her, and there was something in his expression that was different from anything she'd seen in a man's face when he looked at her before. Not admiration exactly, and not pity, and not the particular species of condescension that masqueraded as kindness. Something simpler and more unexpected, something that looked almost like recognition. "Miss Hastings," he said, "I came to Virginia to discuss a business arrangement." "I'm aware. I think," he said slowly, "that I may have significantly underestimated what that arrangement might look like." Eleanor looked at him across 11 years of ledger work and 8 months of careful solitary investigation. "Colonel Ashford," she said, "I think you may have." Outside the study window, Lillian was crossing the yard with a basket of cut flowers and her best afternoon smile, completely unaware that in the room above her, the architecture of the next chapter of all their lives was being quietly and methodically assembled. Silas Mercer arrived for his monthly review at 2 o'clock. He knocked on the study door with his usual comfortable knock. 3 solid raps a man at home in a house that wasn't his. And when Eleanor called "come in," he opened the door and stopped. Nathaniel Ashford was still sitting at the table. The ledgers were still spread across it. Mercer looked at Eleanor, then at Ashford, then at the ledgers. His face didn't change. He was too practiced for that. But something shifted behind his eyes, some rapid interior calculation, and Eleanor watched it happen, and felt for the first time in 8 months something very close to certain. "Mr. Mercer," she said pleasantly, "Colonel Ashford has been reviewing the estate accounts. He had some questions about the 1809 boundary reassessment." She smiled. "I told him you'd be the right person to answer them." Mercer looked at Ashford. Ashford looked at Mercer. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer," Ashford said quietly. "We have a great deal to discuss." Mercer sat, and Eleanor Hastings folded her hands on the table. Both hands, steady still, and waited for the truth she'd been carrying alone for 11 years to finally have somewhere to land. Mercer did not answer right away. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed. Not the sweat at his temple, not the way his hands had gone flat against his thighs, but the silence. Silas Mercer had never been a silent man. In 17 years of monthly reviews, of quarterly reports, of every conversation Eleanor had ever sat through with him, he had always had words ready. Smooth words, comfortable words, the kind of words that filled a room before anyone could think too carefully about what was actually being said. Now he said nothing. Nathaniel Ashford let the silence sit. Eleanor had underestimated that about him, the patience. Most men, when they had an advantage, used it immediately, drove forward, pressed hard. Nathaniel simply sat with his forearms on the table and looked at Mercer with the kind of steady, unhurried attention that said plainly, "I have already decided what I think. I am waiting to see if you are going to tell me the truth or confirm it another way." Mercer cleared his throat. "The 1809 assessment," he said. "That was a complicated year. The county revised the water boundary classifications across the whole district." "Did they?" Nathaniel said. "They did. You can check the county records." "I intend to." Nathaniel tapped the ledger open in front of him. "What I'd like you to explain first is why the revision in the county records reduced the Hastings assessment by 14%, but your corresponding entry in this ledger reflects a reduction of 23%. Mercer looked at the ledger. "Rounding." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Eleanor kept her face perfectly still. "Rounding," Nathaniel repeated. "Survey work isn't precise to the decimal kernel. There's always a margin." 9 percentage points, Nathaniel said, "is not a margin, Mr. Mercer. It is a choice." Mercer's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. "I've managed these accounts for 17 years without a single complaint from Thomas Hastings." "Thomas Hastings," Eleanor said quietly, "relies on your summaries. He doesn't read the primary ledgers." Mercer looked at her. And in that look, fast, sharp, gone in, under a second, was something that was not quite anger, and not quite fear, but lived in the territory between them. She'd seen that look before. She'd seen it every time she'd asked him a question he wasn't prepared for, every time she'd requested documentation he'd expected her to accept on trust. She had never had a name for it until this moment. It was the look of a man who had miscalculated how much someone knew. "Miss Ellie," he said, and his voice had dropped into the register he used when he wanted to sound paternal and reasonable. "I understand you've worked very hard on these records. You always have. But some of what you're looking at requires context that—" "Don't," Eleanor said. He stopped. "Don't call me Miss Ellie," she said. "Don't use that voice. And don't tell me I lack context, because I have been building the context for 11 years, and I know exactly what I'm looking at." The room was very quiet. Nathaniel hadn't moved. Mercer looked between the two of them, and Eleanor could see the calculation happening in real time, the rapid assessment of how much they knew, how much they could prove what his best available move was. She had anticipated this. She had spent 8 months anticipating this exact moment, and she had prepared accordingly. She slid a second folder across the table. "The 1805 sale of the North Creek parcel," she said. 22 acres sold to a Mr. Daniel Hargrove for $340. She opened the folder. "Mr. Hargrove is the brother-in-law of your cousin, Mr. Mercer. The deed was recorded by your brother-in-law at the county clerk's office. The sale price was based on a productivity assessment that used your adjusted figures, not the original 1798 baseline." She looked at him steadily. "The parcel was resold 8 months later for $610. Mercer said nothing. "The 1809 parcel?" She continued, sliding another page forward. "The 1812 parcel?" Another page. The same pattern, the same network, the same spread between sale price and resale value every single time. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than before. Heavier. Mercer's comfortable certainty had curdled into something else, and Eleanor could feel it in the air, the way you feel a change in weather, not visible yet, but unmistakable. "You can't prove intent," Mercer said finally. His voice had changed. The paternal warmth was entirely gone. "Figures get revised. Sales happen at market price. You've got correlations, Miss Hastings, not—" "I have correspondence," Eleanor said. He went still. 3 letters, she said, between you and the land agent coordinating the Hargrove purchase, written in 1804 before the sale, discussing the assessment figures that would need to be in place before the transaction could proceed. She folded her hands on the table. I have copies. It was not entirely true that she had copies. She had one letter which she had transcribed by hand from a document she had found misfiled in the estate correspondence archive in February, and which she had been praying for 8 months represented the pattern she believed it represented. She did not have 3 letters. But Mercer didn't know that, and the way his face changed the color draining from his broad ruddy cheeks, the slight parting of his lips told her everything she needed to know about whether the pattern was real. I think, Nathaniel said very quietly into the silence, that this conversation needs to involve Mr. Thomas Hastings. Her father took it badly. That was not a surprise exactly, but the specific shape of it was, Eleanor had prepared for disbelief. Had prepared for the long process of walking him through the documentation page by page. Had prepared for the particular variety of male resistance that expresses itself as protective concern for the woman raising the alarm, rather than engagement with what she's actually saying. What she hadn't prepared for was the grief. Thomas Hastings sat at the head of his own dining table, with Eleanor's ledgers spread in front of him, and Nathaniel Ashford sitting to his right, and he looked at 17 years of trust being dismantled column by column, and he looked old. He had been looking old for a while. The eyesight, the slower mornings, the way he deferred more and more to Eleanor's summaries without asking questions. But tonight he looked old in a different way. Not diminished. Wounded. Silas, he said. Just the name, nothing after it. Mercer, who had been brought back into the room after being asked to wait in the front parlor for 45 minutes, while Eleanor walked her father through the evidence, said, Thomas, I want you to hear my side of... your side. Thomas Hastings said, Of what? The figures were adjusted within acceptable ranges. The market conditions in those years? You sold my land, Thomas said, to your family. I facilitated transactions that were legally sound. You sold my land. His voice had not risen. That was the thing that silenced the room, the absolute flatness of it, the grief pressing down on every word. I trusted you with my family's land. I trusted you with my daughter's work. He looked up from the ledgers and at Mercer directly. Get out of my house. Mercer opened his mouth. Get out, Thomas Hastings said, before I ask Colonel Ashford to help you do it. Nathaniel had not moved from his chair. He did not move now. He simply looked at Mercer with that steady, unhurried attention, and something in that stillness was apparently sufficient, because Mercer stood and straightened his coat and walked to the door with the stiff dignity of a man who has not yet understood that dignity is no longer available to him. At the door he stopped. He looked at Eleanor. You have no idea, he said, what you've done. I have an excellent idea, she said. He left. Lillian found Eleanor in the study an hour later. Eleanor was recataloguing the ledgers, putting them back in order, her hands moving through the familiar work with the automatic precision of someone who needs something to do with their body while their mind processes what has just occurred. She heard Lillian in the doorway, but didn't turn around. Papa told me, Lillian said. I know. He's Eleanor. He's very shaken. I know that too. A pause. Then, the soft sound of Lillian settling into the chair across the desk, the chair Nathaniel had occupied that morning, which felt like a week ago. Why didn't you tell me? Eleanor set down the ledger she was holding. What would you have done? Lillian stopped. I don't know. Something. You would have told Father immediately, Eleanor said, and Father would have confronted Mercer immediately, and Mercer would have had time to make the documentation disappear. She turned around finally. I needed it to be undeniable before anyone outside this room knew. Lillian was quiet, looking at her with an expression Eleanor couldn't immediately name. Not quite hurt, not quite admiring. Something uncomfortably in between. You've been carrying this alone, Lillian said, for 8 months. I carry most things alone, Eleanor said. It's not a complaint. It's just how things are. It doesn't have to be. Eleanor looked at her sister at the genuine distress in her face, which was real. Eleanor had never doubted that Lillian's feelings were real, only that they were reliably directed, and felt something loosen very slightly in her chest. Not much, but something. "Lillian," she said, "why did you come home early?" Her sister's eyes dropped, just for a second. "I told you, Mrs. Fairfax's house was—" "Lillian." A breath. Then quietly, "I heard Papa had written to Colonel Ashford. Cousin Harriet mentioned it in a letter. She knows someone who knows the Ashford family." Lillian looked up. "I came home to meet him." Eleanor had known this. She had suspected it since the moment that door had opened. But hearing it said plainly was different from suspecting it, and she sat with it for a moment. "He's not what I expected," Lillian said. He pays attention. Not to the things men usually pay attention to." She paused. "He pays attention to you." "He pays attention to information," Eleanor said. "I happen to have information he found useful." "Eleanor." Her sister's voice was oddly soft. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Explain yourself away." Lillian looked at her steadily. "You do it constantly. Something good happens, and you find the practical explanation for why it isn't really good. It's just circumstance or usefulness or coincidence." She shook her head. "He looked at you tonight the way men don't look at ledgers, Eleanor." Eleanor said nothing. Lillian stood smoothing her skirt. At the door she stopped, and Eleanor thought involuntarily of Mercer stopping at the same door an hour ago, the last pause before the walk out. But Lillian's stop was different, quieter. "I'm sorry I came home early," Lillian said. "I think I made tonight harder than it needed to be." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. It was a very dramatic dinner either way. Lillian laughed a real laugh, small and surprised, and left. Eleanor turned back to the ledgers. She sat with her hands flat on the table and let herself just for a moment think about Nathaniel Ashford's face when he'd read her work, the quality of attention he'd given it, the way he'd said, "You've built something here," like it was a fact and not a consolation. She closed the ledger. She had 6 estates to document, and a county attorney to contact in the morning, and a father whose trust in his own judgment was currently in pieces, and a sister who had come home 2 weeks early for reasons that were both entirely transparent, and Eleanor was beginning to think more complicated than they looked. She had a great deal of work to do. She picked up her quill. Nathaniel found her at the window again. Not the back porch this time, the study window, the one that faced the south field where she'd been standing when he arrived the night before. It was past 10 o'clock. The house had gone quiet. She heard his step in the corridor. She was beginning to recognize it, the particular weight and rhythm of it, and then he knocked once on the open study door. "Miss Hastings." "You're still here," she said without turning around. "Your father asked me to stay the night, given the circumstances." A pause. "I hope that's not—" "It's fine," she said. "It's sensible." He came into the room. She heard him stop somewhere behind her, not close the same respectful distance as the porch. "How are you?" The question landed differently than she expected. Not "how is your father?" or "what's the next step with the attorney?" Just "how are you?" plain and direct, like it was the thing he'd actually wanted to ask. She was quiet for a moment. "I've been better," she said. "And I've been worse." "That's honest. I try to be." She turned around. He was standing near the bookcase, his coat off, his collar loosened, less the formal dinner guest, more the man who'd spent the morning reading 11 years of someone else's careful work. He looked tired. She suspected she did too. "I've been thinking about the other estates," she said. "The ones I can document. We need a county-level inquiry, not just a family dispute. Mercer's network is too established for anything local to hold." "I know a man," Nathaniel said. "Name's Alden Pierce. He's a land auditor out of Richmond. Handled a similar situation in Albemarle 3 years ago." He paused. "I can write to him tonight." Eleanor looked at him. "You believe me," she said. "Completely." "I read your work. Most men would have read my work, and then deferred to Mercer anyway. "I'm not most men," he said, not with arrogance, but with the same flat, simple honesty she was beginning to associate with him, this quality of saying true things without dressing them up. "And you're not most women, which I suspect you've spent a considerable amount of time being told is a problem." She said nothing. The truth of it sat in her chest like a stone she'd gotten used to carrying. "Write to Mr. Pierce," she said finally. "I will." He moved to leave, then stopped. At the door. The third person to stop at that door tonight. "Miss Hastings, what Mercer said when he left about you not knowing what you'd done. He was trying to frighten me, I know. But I want you to understand something." He turned and looked at her directly, with that steady, unhurried attention that she had decided over the course of this extraordinary day was the most serious and genuine form of respect she had ever received from anyone. "What you've done, the 11 years of work, the 8 months of building the case, the patience, the precision, that's not nothing. That's not a woman making trouble." He held her eyes. That's someone who held an entire system accountable when no one else was paying attention. You should know that. Eleanor Hastings had received very few compliments in her life that were not actually assessments of her usefulness. She stood in the light of the study lamp and absorbed this one which was neither, and felt something in her chest shift in a way she did not entirely have language for. "Good night, Colonel Ashford," she said. "Good night, Miss Hastings." He tipped his head, not a full bow, something quieter, and left. She stood there for a long moment after his footsteps faded. Then she sat down, pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her, and began drafting the list of documentation she would need for a county-level inquiry. Her handwriting was very steady. Outside, somewhere on the road that ran past Roseland's south gate, a rider was moving fast through the dark headed she would learn in the morning toward Mercer's land office in town. He had not wasted any time, neither would she. The rider Mercer had sent reached town before midnight. Eleanor learned this from their housemaid Martha, who had a sister married to a stable hand at the inn on Court Street, and who appeared at Eleanor's study door at 7 in the morning, with a breakfast tray and the expression of a woman carrying news she wasn't sure she should deliver. "There's talk," Martha said, carefully setting the tray down. "In town. Mr. Mercer's been at the county clerk's office since it opened. Brought a lawyer with him." Eleanor set down her quill. "Which lawyer?" "Mr. Hollis, ma'am. The one who handled the Fairfax property line dispute 2 years back." Eleanor knew Hollis. He was meticulous, expensive, and had a long professional relationship with the land agent network that ran through 3 counties. His presence was not a surprise. It was, in fact, confirmation of something she had suspected since last night, that Mercer was not going to accept what had happened quietly. He was going to move fast and move hard, and he was going to try to get ahead of the documentation before anyone official could look at it. She was already dressed. She had been up since 5. "Tell Colonel Ashford I'd like to speak with him before breakfast," she said. "Please." Martha nodded and left without asking questions, which Eleanor appreciated more than she could say. Nathaniel appeared in the study doorway 7 minutes later, his coat on, but his hair still carrying the slight disorder of a man who'd risen quickly. He looked at her face and skipped the pleasantries entirely. "What happened?" "Mercer is at the county clerk's office with Oliver Hollis," Eleanor said. "He went last night. He's trying to get ahead of us." Nathaniel was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "What's at the clerk's office that he needs to reach first?" "The deed recording files. The original transaction records from 1805, 1809, and 1812. She turned to her desk and picked up the folder she'd already prepared. "I have copies of the entries I could access, but the originals, if he can get certain records amended or reclassified before a formal inquiry is opened, it makes the pattern harder to prove." "His brother-in-law works at the clerk's office," Nathaniel said. "Has worked there for 14 years. He took the folder from her, looked at the top page, looked back up. "How much time do we have?" "The clerk's office opens at 8. It's 7:30 now." She met his eyes. "If your Mr. Pierce is in Richmond, a letter won't reach him in time to matter. We need someone local. Someone with the authority to request a hold on record modifications pending inquiry. The circuit court judge, Nathaniel said immediately. Judge Harlan Cobb. He's based in Charlottesville, but he rides the circuit. He was in Staunton last week, which means he should be in the county seat by now. He was already moving toward the door. I know him. Not well, but enough. If I ride this morning? We ride this morning, Eleanor said. He stopped, turned around. Miss Hastings. The documentation is mine, she said. I built it. I know it better than anyone. If Judge Cobb has questions, I need to be there to answer them. She picked up her own coat from the chair where she'd laid it, already knowing what his next objection would be. And before you tell me it isn't appropriate, Colonel Ashford, I have spent 11 years doing things that weren't considered appropriate for a woman of my position, and the result is sitting in that folder in your hand. I am coming. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I'll have the horses ready in 10 minutes, and left. Eleanor picked up her folder, her documentation case, and her father's signed letter, authorizing her to act on behalf of the Hastings estate. She had asked him for it at 6 that morning, standing at his bedroom door, while he was still half asleep, and he had signed it without hesitation, which told her something important about where his trust now lived. She was downstairs and at the door in 8 minutes. They rode fast, and they didn't talk much, which suited Eleanor fine. The road to the county seat was dry and hard in the summer heat, and she had ridden it enough times to know its rhythms. And she spent the 40-minute journey going through the documentation in her head, every entry, every date, every correspondence, the entire 11-year architecture of what Mercer had built, and what she had built in response, making sure she could present it quickly, clearly, and without the kind of hesitation that gave men reason to doubt. Nathaniel rode beside her and slightly ahead, not protectively, just at the pace of a man who was used to being first through a door. She noticed that he didn't try to slow her down, didn't adjust his speed to accommodate some imagined fragility. He rode like she was a person who could keep up because she was, and the simplicity of that, the complete absence of the management she usually encountered, settled something in her that she hadn't realized was braced. They reached the courthouse at 8:10. The clerk's office was on the ground floor. Through the open door, Eleanor could hear voices. One of them was Hollis. Nathaniel put his hand briefly on her arm, not restraining, just steadying the way you touch someone's arm when you want them to hear you before they walk into a room. Let me go first, he said quietly. Not because you can't handle it, because Hollis knows me, and if he sees you first, he'll try to redirect the conversation to your father's authority before you can establish your own. Eleanor considered this for half a second. It was tactically correct. Fine, she said, but I'm right behind you. I know, he said, and walked in. Hollis was a thin man with a trim beard and the particular expression of someone perpetually calculating how much any given situation was going to cost. He looked up when Nathaniel entered, and his expression went through 3 changes in under 2 seconds: recognition, recalculation, and the professional smoothing that replaced both. Colonel Ashford, he said, this is unexpected. I expect it is, Nathaniel said pleasantly. He glanced at the records spread on the counter. Eleanor, coming in behind him, clocked them immediately. The 1805 deed file, the 1809 water boundary assessment, and a third folder she didn't recognize, but whose tab indicated it was a general correction record. I'm here on behalf of the Hastings estate. I believe you're acquainted with Miss Eleanor Hastings. He stepped slightly to the side. Hollis looked at Eleanor. His pleasant expression did not change, but something behind it did. Miss Hastings, I wasn't aware you had legal authority to act on behalf of... Eleanor placed her father's letter on the counter. Signed this morning, she said. You're welcome to read it. Hollis looked at the letter. He looked at the seal. He looked at Eleanor. Mr. Mercer has engaged me to review certain recording discrepancies that... Mr. Mercer, Nathaniel said, is the subject of a fraud inquiry that I am this morning requesting Judge Cobb to formally open. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without drama, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. Any modification to county records related to Hastings estate transactions prior to that inquiry being opened would constitute interference with a legal proceeding. The room went very still. The clerk behind the counter, a young man Eleanor recognized as Gerald Coombs Mercer's brother-in-law's assistant, which was close enough to the family network to matter, had stopped moving entirely. Hollis set the letter down. "A fraud inquiry," he said. "On what basis?" Eleanor opened her documentation case. 11 years of ledgers, she said. 3 property transactions at artificially suppressed valuations. A correspondence pattern connecting the transactions to a coordinated land agent network operating across 3 counties. She placed the folder on the counter on top of the deed files Hollis had been reviewing. And a letter written in 1804, in which Mr. Mercer and the coordinating agent discussed the assessment figures that would need to be in place before the first transaction could proceed. Hollis looked at the folder. He did not open it. "Those are serious allegations," he said. "They are supported by serious documentation," Eleanor said. A door at the back of the office opened. Silas Mercer walked in. He stopped when he saw them. The stop was only a fraction of a second. He was too practiced for more than that, but Eleanor caught it, and she saw Nathaniel catch it too. "Colonel Ashford," Mercer said. His voice had recovered whatever it had lost the night before. He sounded almost genial. Almost. "I see you've brought Miss Hastings to the county clerk's office. Unusual choice." "Miss Hastings built the case," Nathaniel said. "It seemed appropriate that she present it." "The case." Mercer's geniality thinned at the edges. "You're calling a family dispute over accounting methodology a case now." "I'm calling 17 years of systematic fraud a case," Nathaniel said. "The word choice isn't the interesting part." Mercer looked at Eleanor, and this time the look was different from the one at the dinner table the night before. Less rapid calculation, more something older and harder, the look of a man who has spent a long time being underestimated by people he considered lesser, and is only now beginning to understand that one of them has been watching him the entire time. "You have no idea." He said the same words he'd used at the door of the study, but with different weight now. "How many people in this county are connected to the arrangements you're trying to undo?" "I have a very good idea," Eleanor said. "I've documented 6 estates. I believe there are more. Judge Cobb will have the opportunity to determine the full scope once the inquiry is opened." "Judge Cobb," Mercer said, "is a busy man." "He is," Nathaniel agreed, "which is why I sent a rider to his lodgings at first light this morning. He's expecting us at 10 o'clock. He looked at Mercer with that steady, unhurried attention. "You're welcome to join us, Mr. Mercer. It might be more convenient than receiving the summons later." The silence that followed was the loudest Eleanor had heard yet. Hollis, who had been quiet for several minutes, cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "I think it may be prudent to postpone the recording review until—" "Yes," Mercer said. Flat. Short. "Fine." He looked at Eleanor one more time before he turned and walked back through the door he'd come in. And Eleanor looked back at him, steady, still both hands at her sides, and did not look away first. Judge Harlan Cobb was 63 years old, had been riding the Virginia circuit for 22 years, and had the weathered, unhurried manner of a man who had heard every variety of human dishonesty and was no longer surprised by any of it. He listened to Eleanor's presentation for 45 minutes without interrupting. He asked 4 questions. All 4 were directed at Eleanor, not at Nathaniel, which Eleanor filed away as significant. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the documentation she'd laid out, and was quiet for a long time. "Miss Hastings," he said finally, "you built this yourself." "I did. Over 11 years. The record-keeping was my ordinary work," she said. "The investigation took 8 months." He looked at Nathaniel. "And your role, Colonel?" "I read the documentation yesterday morning," Nathaniel said. "I can confirm the pattern is what Miss Hastings represents it to be. I also have reason to believe the network extends to properties in Albemarle County, which falls within my direct knowledge." Cobb looked at the folders again. 6 estates. That I can document, Eleanor said. I believe there are more. Another long silence. Then Cobb said, I'm going to issue a hold on all county record modifications related to the properties in question effective immediately, and I'm going to write to Alden Pierce in Richmond. He looked at Eleanor. You know Pierce? Colonel Ashford mentioned him. He's the best land auditor in the state. If this is as systematic as your documentation suggests, you need someone with his authority and his methodology. He gathered the folders, straightening them with the careful hands of a man who understood that paper was where truth lived. This is going to take time, Miss Hastings, and it's going to get loud before it gets resolved. Mercer has relationships in this county that go back a long way. I know, Eleanor said. You're not worried. I've been worried for 8 months, she said. I've gotten used to it. It doesn't change what the numbers say. Judge Cobb looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite admiration, but was somewhere in the vicinity of both. No, he said. I suppose it doesn't. He signed the hold order at 11 o'clock. Eleanor held the document in her hands and looked at her own name on it at the request of Miss Eleanor Hastings, acting on behalf of the Hastings estate, and felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not triumph. Too quiet for triumph. Something more like the sensation of a door that had been held shut for a very long time, finally giving way. Nathaniel was watching her. She looked up and found him looking at her with that expression, the one she was running out of ways to describe, that particular quality of attention that felt less like being observed and more like being seen. All right, he said. Yes, she said. And then, because it was true, and because she was tired of explaining her feelings away, better than all right. He nodded once. That almost smile. Good, he said, because we're not finished yet. They were halfway back to Roseland when Nathaniel said without preamble, The 1804 letter. You said you had copies. Eleanor kept her eyes on the road. I said I had a letter. One letter. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. But you told Mercer you had 3. I told Mercer I had correspondence, she said carefully. He drew his own conclusions about the quantity. Another pause. That was a risk. It was a calculation, she said. If there was only one letter and it was an isolated document, he wouldn't have reacted the way he did. He reacted like a man who knows there are more, which means there are more. I just haven't found them yet. Nathaniel looked at her sideways. You bluffed a man with 17 years of practice at deception. I used available information to test a hypothesis, she said. He confirmed it. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before, warmer, somehow edged with something Eleanor was only beginning to allow herself to name. Miss Hastings, Nathaniel said. Colonel Ashford. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly rather than practically. She looked at him then. I'm not sure I know the difference. I think you do, he said. I think you know exactly the difference. I think you've spent so long being practical because it was the only tool you were given that you've convinced yourself it's the only one you have. He held her eyes for a moment, steady, direct, with that quality she kept coming back to of a man who said what he meant, because he'd decided it was worth saying. What do you want, not for the estate, not for the inquiry, for yourself? The question landed in the middle of her chest and sat there. No one had asked her that. Not in 11 years. Possibly not ever. She looked back at the road. The summer heat pressed down on the fields, and the air smelled like dry grass and distance. And somewhere ahead, Roseland was waiting with her father and her sister, and 17 years of tangled truth beginning to unspool. I want it to matter, she said finally. The work. I want it to be not just useful. I want it to have mattered that I did it and not someone else. Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. It already does, he said. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one they'd set out with that morning. And when they reached the gate of Roseland, and Eleanor saw through the trees a carriage she didn't recognize standing in the drive dark, unmarked with a Richmond plate, she felt the familiar brace of readiness settle back into her spine. The quiet was over. Whatever was coming next had already arrived. The carriage belonged to Alden Pierce. Eleanor learned this before she had fully dismounted, because Lillian was already on the front steps with her arms folded, and an expression Eleanor recognized as the specific anxiety her sister wore when something had happened that she didn't know how to manage. "He arrived 20 minutes ago," Lillian said, dropping her voice as they approached. "He said Judge Cobb sent a rider ahead. He said he's been in the county since yesterday on a separate matter, and that the timing was," she paused, "convenient." "Where is he now?" "Papa's sitting room, with Papa." Lillian glanced at Nathaniel, then back at Eleanor. "Mercer came by an hour ago before the man from Richmond arrived. I didn't let him pass the door." Eleanor stopped. "Mercer came here. He asked to speak with Papa. I told him Papa wasn't receiving visitors. He stood on the step for about 30 seconds, deciding whether to push the point, and then he left." Lillian held Eleanor's eyes. "I didn't know if that was right." "That was exactly right," Eleanor said. She moved past her sister toward the door and then stopped and turned back. "Lillian, thank you." Meh. Her sister blinked the quick, unguarded blink of someone receiving something unexpected. "Don't thank me. Just go fix this." Eleanor went inside. Alden Pierce was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone like Judge Cobb, older, circuit-worn, carrying the particular weathered authority of the Virginia legal establishment. Pierce was perhaps 40, with sharp dark eyes behind a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, and the compact, precise manner of a man whose mind moved faster than most conversations he was required to have. He was sitting across from her father with a leather case open on the table between them, and several documents already laid out, which told Eleanor he had not waited for introductions before beginning to work. Her father looked up when she came in, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen in a very long time. Relief, plain and unguarded, the face of a man who had been managing alone, and had just watched the person he trusts most walk through the door. "Eleanor," he said, "this is Mr. Alden Pierce from Richmond. Miss Hastings." Pierce stood, which she had not expected, and extended his hand, which she had expected even less. She shook it. His grip was businesslike, not perfunctory. "Judge Cobb wrote to me 2 months ago about a pattern emerging in the county land records. He didn't have enough to act on at that point. What you've built apparently changes that." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to see the full documentation." "I have it here," she said, and set her case on the table. Pierce sat back down. He opened the first folder with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and within 30 seconds, Eleanor could tell that he was the real thing. Not a man reviewing documents for the appearance of due diligence, but a man actually reading, cross-referencing, noticing. His eyes moved fast and stopped when something required stopping. He turned pages without being prompted and went back to previous pages when he needed to. Nathaniel came in quietly and stood near the wall. Thomas Hastings sat in his chair and said nothing. Eleanor sat across from Pierce and answered the questions he asked, which were precise and few, and always about the same thing: how she knew what she knew and what she had versus what she had inferred. She respected that enormously. After 20 minutes, Pierce set down the folder he was reading and looked at her. "The 1804 letter," he said. "You have the original. I have a transcription. The original is in Mercer's correspondence files at his land office. We'll need the original for the inquiry record." He made a note. "Who else has access to his office?" "His clerk, a man named Dowell. He's been with Mercer for 9 years. She paused. "I don't know where his loyalties sit." Pierce nodded. "The hold Judge Cobb issued this morning covers record modifications at the county clerk's office. It doesn't extend to private correspondence files." He looked up from his notes. "If Mercer decides to remove documents from his own office before we can compel access, we have a problem." The room went quiet. Eleanor had known this. It was the thing that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the courthouse, the piece she hadn't figured out yet. The county records were protected. The private correspondence was not. And Mercer had been in the county since last night, which meant he'd had hours to make decisions about what needed to disappear. His office is on Court Street, Nathaniel said from the wall. I know where it is, Pierce said. I'm saying, Nathaniel said, that it's a public street, and that it would be entirely ordinary for a man to walk past a land agent's office on a weekday morning, and to notice, for instance, whether certain files were being moved. Pierce looked at him for a long moment. I can't ask you to surveil a private office, Colonel Ashford. No, Nathaniel agreed. You can't. Another pause. Then Pierce said carefully, I'll be sending my clerk to the county seat this afternoon to file the formal inquiry paperwork. Court Street is on the route. It is, Nathaniel said. Thomas Hastings, who had been silent through all of this, said quietly, Whatever it takes. Pierce looked at him. The older man sitting in his own sitting room, with 11 years of his daughter's careful work spread on the table in front of him, and something in Pierce's businesslike expression softened just slightly. Mr. Hastings, I want you to understand that this inquiry, once opened formally, will not be a comfortable process. Mercer's network is established. He will push back. There will be people in this county who have benefited from his arrangements and will not be grateful to see them examined. I understand, Thomas said. It may affect relationships your family has held for years. Mr. Pierce, Thomas said, my daughter has been holding up this estate on her own for 11 years, while a man I trusted was stealing from me with both hands. I'm not particularly concerned right now about relationships. He looked at Eleanor, and the look was the same as the one from the door at 6 that morning, direct, tired, and absolutely without qualification. Whatever Eleanor needs, that's what we do. Eleanor looked at her father and said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. She looked back at Pierce. Tell me what you need from me, she said. Pierce worked through the afternoon. Eleanor stayed with him answering questions, pulling documents, clarifying entries. Nathaniel came and went once to speak with Pierce's clerk, before the man rode to the county seat once to send a second letter to Judge Cobb with additional documentation Eleanor had identified that morning. Lillian brought food at 2 o'clock that nobody ate and took it away again at 3 without comment. At 4:30, Pierce set down his pen and sat back. I can document 8 estates, he said. Eleanor looked up. I had 6. You had 6 in Hastings County. I've been working a separate matter in the next county over for 3 weeks. He looked at her steadily. The pattern is identical. Same network, same methodology, same directional bias in the assessments. Different properties, same hand. He paused. This is not a local operation, Miss Hastings. This is coordinated, and it's been running for at least 15 years. The number landed in the room like a stone in still water. 15 years, 8 estates, a network spanning multiple counties. And Silas Mercer, at the center of it, smiling his comfortable smile, and calling her Miss Ellie, and summarizing her reports for her father in language that made everything sound simpler and less alarming than it was. How many families? Thomas said from his chair. At minimum 8, Pierce said. Possibly more. The inquiry will determine the full scope. He closed his folder. The important thing right now is the original correspondence. If Mercer's private files contain what Miss Hastings believes they contain, this case becomes significantly stronger. Without them, we're working from secondary documentation. Strong secondary documentation, but secondary. He'll have moved them, Eleanor said, or destroyed them. Maybe, Pierce said. Or maybe he hasn't had time or hasn't decided to, because he still believes he can talk his way out of this, the way he's talked his way out of everything else for 15 years. He looked at her. Men like Mercer tend to overestimate their ability to manage a situation. It's usually what undoes them. As if on cue, there was a sound from the front of the house. The knocker 3 sharp raps, and then Martha's voice, and then another voice that Eleanor recognized before she could see the face. She was on her feet before Pierce had finished turning his head. Mercer was in the front hallway. He hadn't waited to be shown in. He was standing in the middle of the hall with his hat in his hands, and the particular expression of a man performing a humility he does not feel. And when Eleanor came through the sitting room door, he looked at her with eyes that had nothing humble in them at all. "Miss Hastings," he said, "I'd like to speak with your father. My father is occupied." "I understand. This won't take long." He glanced past her toward the sitting room where Pierce had appeared in the doorway. Mercer's eyes moved over him quickly, a professional assessment the same kind Eleanor had learned to make, and she watched him take in the leather case, the Richmond manner, the wire-rimmed spectacles, and understand what they meant. His jaw tightened. "Who is that?" "Alden Pierce," Eleanor said. "From Richmond." A pause. Very small. "The auditor." "Yes." Mercer looked back at her, and this time the look was stripped of everything: the geniality, the paternal warmth, the comfortable authority of a man in a house where he had always been welcome. What was underneath was harder and older, and Eleanor thought more honest. "You've moved fast," he said. "I've been moving for 8 months," she said. "Today just looked faster because you were watching." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I came to offer a settlement. To your father. A private resolution, the parcels returned, the accounts reconciled, no formal inquiry." "The inquiry is already formally opened," Eleanor said. Something in his face changed. "As of when?" "This afternoon." He absorbed this. He was very still. "There are people involved in this, Miss Hastings, who are not going to—" "I know," she said. "You've told me twice now that I don't understand what I've done. I understood it the first time. My answer hasn't changed." Nathaniel appeared beside Eleanor. She wasn't sure from which direction only, that suddenly he was there, slightly forward, not blocking, but present in the way that meant something. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Mercer looked at him, then back at Eleanor. Then he put his hat on. "You should know," he said at the door, "that there are men in this county who will not take this quietly, men with more reach than I have." "Then they'll be part of the inquiry too," Eleanor said. "Thank you for making that clear, Mr. Mercer." He left. The front door closed. Eleanor stood in the hallway for a moment, aware that her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the accumulated weight of the day pressing through now that the immediate demand of it had passed. She pressed them flat against her sides. Nathaniel turned to look at her. "You all right, ma'am?" The word ma'am, quiet and direct, and without the slightest trace of condescension, did something unexpected to the tightness in her chest. She breathed in. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." "He's not done," Nathaniel said. "No, he's not." She straightened. "But neither are we." Pierce left at 6 with 3 copies of the core documentation and a commitment to return within the week with the formal inquiry structure. Nathaniel stayed. Thomas Hastings had asked him again, and he had agreed without hesitation, and Eleanor was aware of a quiet gratitude she didn't know quite what to do with. Dinner was quieter than the night before. The 4 of them, Thomas, Eleanor, Lillian, Nathaniel, sat at the same table where 2 nights ago this had all been a formal dinner and an arranged meeting and a sister arriving unannounced. It felt like a year ago. It felt like this morning. Halfway through the meal, Lillian said without looking up from her plate, "The Caldwell estate is one of the 8, isn't it?" Everyone looked at her. "I spent 6 weeks in Charleston," she said. "Mrs. Fairfax is a Caldwell cousin." She talked constantly about the land disputes her family had been having, assessments that didn't match what they remembered, sales that happened at prices that never made sense. She set down her fork. "I thought it was just family grievance. People always think their land is worth more than it sells for." She looked at Eleanor. "It wasn't, was it?" "No," Eleanor said quietly. "It wasn't." Lillian was silent for a moment. "I had information. I didn't know it was information." "You couldn't have known." "But you would have." She said it simply, without self-pity. "If you'd been there, you would have heard what she was describing and known immediately what it connected to." She picked her fork back up. I'm not good at this. The numbers, the patterns. I know that. A pause. I'm sorry I came home early. I made that dinner into something it didn't need to be. You also held Mercer at the door this morning, Nathaniel said. That mattered. Lillian looked at him slightly startled. Anyone would have. Not anyone, he said. A lot of people would have let him in out of courtesy. You made a call without knowing all the facts, and you made the right one. Lillian considered this. Eleanor watched her sister receive a compliment from a man she had come home 2 weeks early to meet about an action that had nothing to do with charm or beauty or social grace, and watched something shift in Lillian's expression. Not dramatic, not the kind of shift that announced itself, but the quiet kind. The kind that meant something had been understood that hadn't been understood before. Thomas set down his glass. There's something I haven't told you, he said. Everyone looked at him. The reason I trusted Mercer, he said. Beyond the years and the familiarity. He looked at the table. He knew things. About the estate, about our finances, about dealings I'd had in the early years that I wasn't proud of. Small things, nothing illegal, but the kind of things a man doesn't want examined too closely. He paused. I think I let myself believe his accounts were correct, because the alternative was having those dealings looked at. The room was very quiet. He had leverage, Eleanor said. Yes. Her father looked at her. I didn't know I was giving it to him. But yes. He exhaled. Whatever comes out in the inquiry, I want you to know I'm prepared for it. All of it. Eleanor looked at her father. At 61 years old in the dinner chair he'd sat in for 30 years, saying the hardest thing he'd said in probably a decade. Thank you for telling me, she said. He nodded once. He picked up his glass. Nathaniel was watching Eleanor across the table, and when she glanced at him, he held her eyes for just a moment. Steady level something in it that said, I heard that, and I'm not going anywhere before looking back at his plate. She looked back at hers. Outside, the summer dark had settled fully over Roseland, and somewhere on Court Street, in the county seat, a man was making decisions about what to keep and what to burn. And somewhere in 3 neighboring counties, 8 families were sitting down to their own dinners without knowing yet that the accounting of years of quiet theft was finally irreversibly underway. And at a dining table in Virginia, 4 people sat in the particular silence of those who have done everything they can for one day and know that tomorrow will ask more of them still. It was Eleanor who spoke first. Mr. Pierce mentioned something this afternoon, she said, setting down her fork. About the Caldwell connection. If Lillian can write to Mrs. Fairfax with specific questions I'll prepare, we may be able to establish a direct testimonial link to the same network in Charleston. She looked at Lillian. Would you be willing to do that? Lillian looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Tell me exactly what to ask. Eleanor almost smiled. I will, she said. Tonight. Lillian's letter to Mrs. Fairfax went out the next morning. Eleanor had sat with her sister until past midnight, drafting the questions, not as accusations, not as a legal document, but as the kind of careful, specific inquiry that would read to Mrs. Fairfax like a concerned friend following up on a conversation, and would read to Alden Pierce like exactly what it was, a targeted request for testimonial evidence connecting the Charleston land network to the same methodology operating in Virginia. Lillian had copied it out in her own hand, in her own voice, with the particular warmth she had that Eleanor did not, and the result was something Eleanor could not have written herself. Something that would actually get a response. She told Lillian that at midnight, standing in the hallway before they went to their separate rooms. Lillian looked at her for a moment. You could have written it yourself if you'd wanted to. I could have written something, Eleanor said. Not that. Her sister was quiet. Then softly, We're not so different, Eleanor. We're just different tools, for the same work. Eleanor thought about that as she went to bed. She thought about it more than she expected to. She was up again at 5. Chapter A. Pierce returned on the 4th day, not the 7th. He arrived before breakfast with 2 men from Richmond, a junior auditor, and a court recorder, and a leather case that was visibly heavier than the one he'd left with. He came through the front door with the focused energy of someone who had not slept adequately and did not intend to let that slow him down. And the first thing he said to Eleanor before his coat was even off was, "We found the correspondence files." Eleanor went still. "Mercer's private files." His clerk Dowell came to us. Pierce set his case on the hall table and looked at her directly. 2 days ago. He'd been with Mercer 9 years. When the formal inquiry opened, he apparently spent 24 hours deciding which side of this he wanted to be on, and then he walked into Judge Cobb's office with a box of documents and asked for his name to be kept out of the public record if possible. What was in the box? 14 letters, Pierce said. Going back to 1801. Not 3 Miss Hastings. 14. The 1804 letter you had was the 6th in a sequence. There are 5 before it, establishing the entire framework of the arrangement, who was involved, what the methodology was, how the proceeds were distributed. He held her eyes. There are also 2 letters from 1812 that name specific county officials who were aware of the scheme and took a percentage in exchange for ensuring the deed recordings processed without review. The hallway was very quiet. County officials, Eleanor said. 2. One of them is still in office. She absorbed this. The scope of it. 15 years, 8 estates county officials, a distribution network that had been running so smoothly and for so long that it had become simply the way things worked, settled into her chest with a weight that was not quite shock, because she had always suspected the network was larger than what she could see, but was something heavier than confirmation. "Who knows?" she said. "Judge Cobb, my office. You as of now." Pierce picked up his case. "The official disclosure happens this morning, in the county seat, which is why I came early." He looked at her steadily. "I need you there, Miss Hastings. You're the originating complainant. Your presence matters." Eleanor was already turning toward the stairs. "Give me 10 minutes." She gave herself 8. The county seat on a Thursday morning in July was not a place that expected drama. It was a place of ordinary business, farmers settling accounts, merchants filing paperwork, the slow administrative rhythm of a Virginia county that had been running the same way for decades. The kind of place where nothing much happened. By 9 o'clock, it understood that something much was happening. Pierce made the formal disclosure in Judge Cobb's courtroom, which was not large and which filled quickly. Word moved fast in small counties, and the presence of 2 men from Richmond and a leather case full of correspondence had been noted and discussed since 7 that morning. Eleanor sat at the table designated for the complainant's representation. Nathaniel sat beside her, which she had not asked for, and which she had not told him not to do. Judge Cobb read the summary of findings into the formal record. 8 estates, 14 letters, 15 years, 2 county officials, a distribution network involving at least 7 individuals across 3 counties. The room, which had been buzzing when people took their seats, went entirely silent. Eleanor sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her and looked straight ahead and listened to 11 years of her own work being read into the public record of the Commonwealth of Virginia. She had imagined this moment in the abstract during the worst nights of the past 8 months, the 3 in the morning nights when the documentation felt insufficient and the pattern felt unprovable, and the whole careful structure she'd built felt like it could dissolve under the first serious pressure. She had imagined it as relief. It was not relief exactly. It was something larger and less comfortable than relief. It was the feeling of a thing that had been carried alone for a very long time, being set down in a public place where it could not be picked up and quietly removed. It was permanent. It was irrevocable. And it was, Eleanor thought, sitting very straight in her chair, exactly right. When Cobb finished reading, the room started talking all at once. Pierce called for order, got it mostly, proceeded to outline the legal next steps, compelled testimony from all named parties, revaluation of all affected properties, formal proceedings against the 2 county officials, and a civil claim process for the affected families to recover losses. A man in the back row stood up. Eleanor didn't know him. "How much was taken?" he said. He, Pierce looked at his notes. Current estimate across 8 estates, over 15 years, somewhere between $14,000 and $18,000 in suppressed value lost sale equity and diverted proceeds. He paused. That estimate will be refined as the audit continues. The room erupted again. Eleanor watched it. The noise, the outrage, the rapid spread of recognition as people began identifying which families they knew who held land in the affected counties, began doing the calculation of who else might have been touched by something they'd assumed was just the ordinary unfairness of the market. She watched a county that had been quietly losing money for 15 years begin to understand what had been happening to it. And then she saw Mercer. He was standing at the back of the room near the door with Hollis beside him. He had come. She wasn't sure what had made him come, some residual belief that he could still manage the situation perhaps, or simply the compulsion to be present when the thing he'd built for 15 years came apart. He was watching Pierce with the expression of a man watching a building he constructed fall down around him, and he was very still. He looked up and found Eleanor looking at him from across the room. She did not look away. He did. The official proceedings took the rest of the morning. Eleanor answered questions from Judge Cobb's recorder for 2 hours, precise, documented, methodical, every claim anchored to a specific entry in a specific ledger on a specific date. Pierce sat beside her and occasionally clarified procedural points, but most of the time he simply let her speak because she didn't need clarification. She knew this material the way she knew the Hastings bottomland, by feel, by memory, by 11 years of paying attention when no one else thought it mattered. By noon, Silas Mercer had been formally served with a compelled testimony summons. By 12:30, one of the county officials named in the letters had sent a representative to Judge Cobb's office requesting to discuss terms. By 1 o'clock, Eleanor Hastings was standing on the courthouse steps in the July heat, and the case she had built alone in a study for 8 months was fully irrevocably in the hands of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and there was nothing left to do but let it proceed. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. They stood there together in the heat and looked at the town going about its suddenly more complicated business, and Eleanor felt the exhaustion of the past 4 days settle into her. All at once, the kind of exhaustion that only comes when the thing holding you upright is no longer immediately required. "He looked at you," Nathaniel said, "in the courtroom." "I know. You didn't look away." "No," she said. "I didn't." A pause. "How do you feel?" She thought about the question. Actually thought about it, which she was beginning to do more often when he asked her something, instead of immediately translating it into its practical component. "Like I've been holding a door shut for a very long time," she said, "and I just let go." "Does it feel the way you expected?" She looked at the street, the ordinary traffic of an ordinary town that had just had an extraordinary morning, and considered. "It feels like the beginning of something," she said, "which I hadn't anticipated." "What kind of beginning?" She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with that expression, the one she'd spent 5 days trying to name, and had finally sometime around 3 in the morning 2 nights ago admitted to herself she was done pretending not to understand. It was not admiration. It was not professional regard. It was something simpler and more consequential than either. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think it might be a good one." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I'd like to discuss something with you, when you're ready. Not today. Today you've earned the right to simply be finished for an afternoon." He paused. "But soon." "About the estate," she said. "About us," he said. Eleanor Hastings, who had spent 26 years being practical about everything, who had spent 11 years finding the useful explanation for every good thing that happened to her, so she wouldn't be foolish enough to expect it to stay looked at. Nathaniel Ashford on the courthouse steps in the July heat, and said, "All right. Just that. Just all right." It was enough. The letter from Mrs. Fairfax arrived 6 days later. It was 4 pages densely written, and it confirmed everything. The Caldwell estate had experienced the same pattern assessments revised downward over a period of 9 years. 2 parcels sold through the same agent network, the same family of buyers appearing at suppressed prices. Mrs. Fairfax, had she wrote, always believed something was wrong, but had no language for what, no framework, and no one who took her seriously when she tried to describe it. She had wept when she read Lillian's letter, she said. She had not known anyone else saw it. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she set it on Pierce's growing file and sat quietly for a moment. Lillian appeared in the study doorway. "Well?" "It's everything we needed," Eleanor said. Her sister exhaled a long, slow exhale that carried a great deal of the tension of the past week. "Good." She came in and sat down in the chair across the desk, the chair that had been Nathaniel's and then Pierce's, and that was beginning to feel like a chair for people Eleanor was willing to let see her work. "Eleanor, can I ask you something?" "Yes." "What happens now to Mercer, to the families?" "The audit continues. The civil claims process will take months, possibly longer. Some of the land sales can be legally challenged, some can't. The families will recover some of what they lost, probably not all of it." She paused. "Mercer will face criminal proceedings. So will the county officials. And the estate. Our estate will be revalued at the correct figures. The 3 parcels sold between 1805 and 1812 will be part of the civil claim." She looked at her sister. "I don't know how much comes back, but the accounting will be accurate from here forward." Lillian was quiet for a moment. "And what do you want from here forward?" Eleanor thought about Nathaniel on the courthouse steps. About soon. About the beginning she'd described that she didn't have a name for yet. "I want to keep doing this," she said. "The work. Properly, with authority, not just in practice. I've been managing this estate without the standing to legally represent it for 11 years. That needs to change." "Papa will make it official," Lillian said immediately. "He should have done it years ago. I'll tell him so myself if he needs reminding." "Lillian." "I mean it." Her sister looked at her steadily. "You've been holding this family together with numbers and patience and 11 years of work that no one saw because you did it quietly in a room by yourself. The least we can do is put your name on the door." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "That was rather well said. I have my moments." Lillian stood smoothing her skirt in the familiar gesture. At the door she paused. "He's going to ask you," she said quietly. "Colonel Ashford. He's going to make it formal." "I know." "Is that are you, Lillian?" Eleanor met her sister's eyes. "I'm all right." Lillian studied her for a moment. Then she nodded once and left. Eleanor sat alone in the study for a little while. She was not thinking about ledgers. She was not thinking about the inquiry, or the correspondence, or the civil claims process. She was thinking about what it felt like to have her work seen truly. Seen, not summarized, not appreciated in the abstract, not tolerated as a charming eccentricity, but read and understood and acted upon by someone who had the capability to do all 3. She was thinking about what it felt like to have that be the foundation of something. It felt, she thought, like being on solid ground, like land that had always been hers, finally measured correctly. Nathaniel found her in the study that evening. He knocked. She told him to come in. He came in and sat in the chair across from her and looked at her with that expression she had finally stopped trying to translate and simply allowed to mean what it meant. "I've written to my attorney," he said, "to begin dissolving the original letter of arrangement your father and I had." Eleanor looked at him. Dissolving it. The letter proposed a traditional arrangement, property considerations, household establishment, the standard terms. He held her eyes. "I don't want standard terms." "What do you want?" "A partnership," he said. "Formal and legal and specific. You maintain full authority over Hastings estate management. Your name on all documents, your signature required on all transactions, your standing recognized by every county attorney and court recorder in Virginia." He paused. "And whatever else we choose to build together, we build as equal parties. Nothing arranged, nothing assumed. Agreed to." The room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel Ashford, who had come to Virginia for a dinner and had spent 5 days reading her work and standing beside her in courtrooms and asking her how she felt. When the answers were hard, who said what he meant because he'd decided it was worth saying, who had looked at 11 years of solitary labor and called it what it was. "You came here to find a wife," she said. "I came here to discuss an arrangement," he said. "I told you that the first night. What I found was considerably more than I arranged for." He leaned forward slightly. "Miss Hastings, Eleanor, I am asking you, not your father, not the letter of intent, not the social convention that says I should have asked 3 days ago. I am asking you." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the door she'd let go of on the courthouse steps. She thought about what she'd told him, the beginning of something. She thought about the land correctly measured, finally hers. "Yes," she said. "Those are my terms, too." He exhaled, just slightly, just enough to tell her he'd been holding that breath. He reached across the desk, and she put her hand in his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the lamplight of the study, where 11 years of truth had been assembled, one column at a time. "There is one condition," Eleanor said. "Name it." "You never call me Miss Ellie." He looked at her with that almost smile that had finally, over the course of 5 extraordinary days, become a real one. "Miss Hastings," he said. "That was never a risk." The inquiry ran for 4 months. At the end of it, Silas Mercer was convicted on 7 counts of fraud and stripped of his land agent license. 2 county officials resigned. 5 of the 8 affected families successfully reclaimed portions of their losses. The Hastings estate was revalued at its correct acreage, 412 acres of Virginia bottomland, productive and accurately measured, and Eleanor Margaret Hastings was formally designated as its legal manager and representative. Her name on every document, her signature required on every transaction, her standing recognized by the county court, the circuit court, and the office of Alden Pierce in Richmond. Pierce sent her a letter when it was finalized. It said in its entirety, "The Commonwealth of Virginia is better served by your attention to its records than by anyone currently on its official payroll. Enclosed, please find the formal certification. It is, if you'll permit me to say so, long overdue." She kept the letter in the top drawer of the study desk under the original 1798 deed to the Hastings property and a copy of the first ledger she had ever kept in her 15-year-old handwriting before she'd known what she was building toward. Nathaniel moved to Roseland in October, not as a guest, not as a visitor, as a partner in the legal sense, in the practical sense, and in every sense that mattered more than either. He brought his Albemarle land records with him and sat down across from Eleanor at the study table and said, "I think my southern acreage has the same water boundary issue your original deed had." And she said, "I know. I noticed it when your father's attorney sent the survey." And he looked at her for a long moment and said, "Of course you did." And they set to work. Thomas Hastings died in the spring of 1817, peacefully in the bedroom he'd slept in for 40 years. He had spent the last 18 months of his life watching his daughter manage the estate she had always managed with the authority she had always deserved, and he had said to her once in the way of men who do not say things easily, "I should have done this years ago." Eleanor had said, "Yes, but you did it now." And that was all either of them needed it to be. Lillian married in 1818, a circuit court clerk from Charlottesville, who had been present at the October proceedings, and who had apparently taken careful note of the Hastings sisters during the inquiry. Not the beautiful one, as Lillian reported to Eleanor with a kind of wondering amusement, but both of them together as a force of nature he wanted to be adjacent to. He was not wrong. He made Lillian laugh. Eleanor liked him immediately. The Caldwell estate in Charleston was restored to its correct valuation in 1816, and Mrs. Fairfax sent Lillian a second letter that was 3 pages of relief and gratitude, and an invitation to visit in the autumn. Lillian went. Eleanor did not, because there was a water rights renegotiation with the neighboring county that autumn that required her presence in 3 separate courtrooms, but she sent a letter with Lillian that Mrs. Fairfax read aloud at dinner to her entire family. The land endured, the numbers held, And Eleanor Hastings, who had sat at a dining room table on a summer evening in 1815, with her hands folded in her lap, and watched a door open and her sister walk through it, and a man turn his head, and had pressed her fingers against 11 years of careful work, and held herself still. Eleanor Hastings had known even then, in some part of herself she didn't have language for yet, that the truth she carried was stronger than anything that had been built to hide it. She had been right. She was always right about the numbers, and the numbers in the end had given her everything.